Can I ask, there's a reason I mentioned the hijab, which I'll elaborate on in a second, but are there Palestinian Christians that cover their hair? Does it exist?
In church, yes, we are requested to do that in church. We don't actually do. Some people enforce it, but some don't.
Yeah.
But I would say the other way, there are some Muslims who do not wear scarf, and this is also common in Palestine. So we have that kind of, like we have a part of a continuum in Palestine as any other society, but it's totally different. We have more of social liberty somehow than other Arab countries, despite the fact that people could look otherwise because we are an occupied country. But we have a bit of a space, and I think sometimes it could be relating to occupation, because occupation has done some good push for Palestinian women at some point, because it brought them to the front lines. Because it brought us to the front lines of fighting, which can be negatively used but positively used mostly. Because during the intifadas, during the fights, women were also in the front lines. They were partners in the resistance. They were partners when they protected the families, when they brought up the children, when they helped the wounded, when they took part into the intellectual ones, and they were also fighters. They were soldiers as well. So the resistance against the occupation, let's say, not the occupation itself, helped women, Palestinian women, rise up and become a more dependent part of the community as such. And there's a huge women movement in Palestine that has, I mean, we still have our challenges. We're still having our basic challenges, let's say, in an Arab world, but still we have gone a bit further at some point, but still not in all places, because we still have child marriages. We still have so much violence against women in Palestine in massive numbers.
I just want to mention, the reason I mentioned hijab was because we did a poll for our, and I want to hear, even though Ziriab is not a woman, obviously, I still want to hear his opinion on this, perhaps Victoria's as well. So we polled our audience, we asked them these questions. So these are the attitudes of Arabs that live inside and outside the Arab world. So we asked them if they think that hijab can be an expression of feminism, not is it a blanket expression? Because obviously hijab can be used to oppress and it can be used to liberate. It depends how you're doing it, right? And 93% said yes, it can be it is possible for hijab to be an expression of feminism. So there was a unanimity there. And then there was another gender-related issue we asked about, which is, do you prefer to marry a partner from your native country over an Arab or non-Arab in the West? And only 31% said that they prefer that. But we did some analysis on this, and we think that this could be because a lot of our Arab audience live outside the Arab world. Yes.
But I like some of the questions. I need to take part in your polls and analysis.
Yes, we asked quite a few. But I wanted to, when do you think that covering, at what context, if you wanted to, imagine that we're talking to someone that has no understanding of hijab or Islam or gender issues in Islam, and they were completely ignorant on their perspective, and they had the what is now the default position that if you wear the hijab, you're repressed. If you had the opportunity to clarify to them how hijab can liberate an individual, and when it can, and the certain context where applying hijab can become oppressive, how would you clarify that to an individual?
Can I ask you a reverse question before I let the floor to people? When did wearing a scarf became a sign of oppression to begin with? So my main question would be, when wearing a hijab or something that is related to a cult or a culture or a behavior became a sign of oppression? Who said that? It's like, how? Why do you think? Like, when did hijab even became an issue? When did hijab became, or wearing a scarf or covering your hair became an issue? Why wasn't it about why wearing shorts became an issue, which became an issue actually? Do you remember a story? Like, I remember there's the whole story of measuring women's bikini and how long they should have been on a Western beach. But so the question, I think the origin became, when did hijab or wearing a scarf became an issue or a sign of oppression? And this is where the conversation could start. Why did it even became that kind of issue to begin with?
I have an
Then I would have my
instinctive
opinion.
answer. I have an instinctive answer, but I want to hear if you have an opinion on this first before I express it.
I don't know. I don't want to talk. I talk too much. I want to hear the girls. But yes, I agree that wearing hijab can be an expression of feminism.
Does anyone else have an opinion on this before I express myself?
I wrote a paper on this, on covering your hair, or covering in general, the veiling. I have my personal opinion about it, but I agree that it can be an expression of feminism, and it can be a source of oppression. I think about the veil in the context of not just the physical covering of the hair or the body. I think about it more in terms of the occupation of space. Would the veil, would the physical veil marginalize you, or push you toward the edge and occupy less public space, or will you still be able to occupy public spaces? So for me, it's just that the veil has to do so much with my ability or inability to be present in public spheres, in public spaces, rather than be pushed in private spaces. So I think that would probably that relates to the idea of if it being oppressive or if it being liberating. If I am able to express myself, whether I'm wearing it or not, and I have my voice loud wherever I go, then the physical manifestation of a veil does not exist. But like, for example, where I grew up, girls don't wear hijab. I mean, we have some who do, but it's not, at least in the younger generation don't wear it. My grandma, I think, only wore it when she was in her 70s or something. So I guess, but what we were told culturally, or from a religious perspective, I don't know, that there's a thing, صوت المرأة عورة, which what would that be?
The voice of a woman is to be treated like a private part.
Yeah, so that to me, that translates into a veil that's not just a veil you put on your head, but that's just a way of you being pushed to a private space and be marginalized and occupy less public space. So that's when the veil, whether physical covering or whatever type of covering it is, if it's veiling you from occupying public space, from speaking loudly, and from being heard, then that is when it becomes problematic. Otherwise, I mean, you wear whatever you want to wear. You want to put a hijab on, you want to wear shorts, whatever you want to wear, you should be able to wear.
I feel that this comparative approach can be quite helpful when it comes to these kind of questions, right? A headscarf can be a lot of things, right? It can be a symbol for oppression, it can be a symbol for liberation, it can be a religious symbol, it can be a cultural symbol, it can be an identifier for class, right? You have countries where it's only poor women or rural women will wear headscarf, whereas more educated and urban women won't, or vice versa, right? The other way around. So it can be an awful lot of things. Context, again, is really, really, really important in this, when it comes to this question. When it comes to dealing with people who ask these sort of questions that you mentioned at the very beginning, Osama, right? I find what really, really helps is to take this comparative perspective, right? And to say, look, a headscarf can be a lot of things, right? But so can a miniskirt, right? A miniskirt can be
Exactly.
It can be a symbol for liberation, and for some women, it has historically and still is today a symbol for liberation, whereas for others it's a symbol for sexual exploitation, right?
Exactly.
So it can be anything and everything, and it really just depends on the context. Um, yeah, in the end, I mean, I so agree with what Chada just said. And again, this is something I would say to these people: it's about choice. It's never about a piece of clothing. It's never about a symbol, right? I mean, nothing can be just one symbol that stands for one thing, because it all depends on context. Right? I still remember, like, when I was doing my field research in Lebanon, and then I had one of my favorite dresses. It's like a long black dress, and I loved this dress, and it was just so comfortable to wear, and it was the most practical. But I wore this in Lebanon, and they all thought I was super conservative, because over there they see this as an abaya. They don't see this as a long dress. It's an abaya, and it means you are conservative. That's it. And I was in a conservative corner, and I could do whatever else I wanted. I could wear like my pink hijabs. I could wear my rainbow color hijabs. I was in the conservative corner, and end of question, right? But it's like a very contextual thing. Like it wouldn't be read in the same way. I don't know, in Birmingham or in London or in Paris or in Frankfurt.
I agree.
Can I?
Yeah, go on.
Sorry, just before you say, Sama, for me, for this context, for me, hijab is politics, because hijab was politicized, and this is the case for me. It stopped becoming a choice or a sign of oppression in a religion or not. Because like for us, covering your head and scarf is something that has become very. It was like in religion and in church, like there was some very conservative priest who came to our town, and he started doing that and pushing it. But actually, it is part of so many religions, and where like covering up and covering women, etc. It's a different thing. But I think hijab became a political tool to say that Islam is oppressing women, to say that this kind of religion is stopping women from being who they are, where you are, like it's a symbol of everything, like Jennifer said. But for me, it's a political tool. It became politics because hijab became defying people, where people had to defend themselves because they wore them. It pushed people to wear them, and it pushed people to hate people who wear them. It's like it became a political. For me, it's politics. It became politics. It's regressed from all the other meanings. Because as a feminist or as a woman, I believe that wearing a headscarf, wearing a short, putting a tattoo, being gay, being straight, being a mother, being single are all forms of how a feminist could express herself in that sense. But for me, hijab now is very political. It stopped being all the other components where it's religious, it's private, is it oppressed, is it oppression, is it freedom, is it etc. For me, it became a political thing where it became a statement against or a statement with. If you take Turkey, for example, Turkey is a striking example of how this goes, like Turkey and Iran, but I would say Turkey as well, because Turkey is a really confusing model for people who talk about like an Islamic state who are trying to, I don't know, to get back the Ottoman Empire at some point, but the Turkish hijab and using hijab there is something that it's like it became a political, for me, it's a political symbol that brings in so many things with it. It's like if you are with a hijab, then you are part of that culture, of that understanding, of that political stance. If you're not, then you are that something else. So it became, for me, it became an object that is used politically.
Interesting.
Palestinian friend of mine, she actually spoke about this, but with regards to Palestine, and she said that in her community in Palestine, she's like from Muslim background, and she said there were only two women. You either wore hijab, or maybe it was a rural area, and she said you either wore hijab and then you were Muslim, or you didn't and then you were communist. And she said people were really confused when they asked her, what are you? And she said, I'm Muslim. But they were like, but you don't wear hijab. And then they said, are you communist? And she was like, no. And they were like, huh? And then after a while, she realized that there were only these two categories for them. So she said, well, next time when I asked her, are you communist? She was like,
I know that specific town, yes. It's very cultural ingrained as well. It's very country specific. I would again say I had experiences in Egypt, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Palestine, and I can tell you, all what we discussed is very country specific in each country, and it has its own story.
Absolutely.
And yes, it's the same for us. For us in my town, we are a Christian minority in the big region of our governorate, but we have a Muslim minority within our country, within our village. So we are a Christian village, but we have a Muslim minority, but we are a minority village in a big combination of big villages. So all this controversy of understanding that. And if you were in my hometown, if you don't wear a scarf, then you're Christian. If not, you're Muslim. And I remember our Muslim neighbor. He was our only Muslim neighbor in our neighborhood. But because he is from this town, Muslims from an adjacent town, they would call him the Christian because he comes from our town. So it's all about, it's like the references. So they called him the Christian just because he's Muslim, but they call him the Christian because he came from our town. And it's all about that kind of impressions that you take, and then just like you stick all these stereotypes to people. You're either this or that.
Can I mention a point in response to Jennifer?
So interesting. I also, sorry, Osama, just one more thing quickly in response to what Leila just said. I also I grew up in an environment where if you wore hijab, you were in the minority, right? And I sometimes wonder if I had grown up in an environment where hijab is the norm.
It's prevalent, yeah.
Right, for women to wear. I sometimes wonder, would I wear it today? I sometimes really, really, really wonder. And I mean, there's part in me who says like, yes, I still would, because I believe in, there's the theological aspect, right? And I believe in that. But then there's also part of me who acknowledges how important society is and how important context is and how important our communities are. Yeah, so I think it's this question of minority, majority, right? Like it's a really, really, really interesting question.
I totally agree, but then the same question goes: if Muslims didn't feel threatened in Europe, would they be trying to show more that they are Muslims in these communities or not? And this reflects also as a Christian. Sometimes we try too hard to show how Christian we are because we are a minority in a majority of a Muslim community. So some young people resort to wearing like big crosses or showing they are Christian somehow, like wearing everything that has to do with that, or just bringing it up the first minute you ask them who they are, because they feel threatened, because their identity is threatened by this kind of stuff. So they try to show it more. And I think it's a very interesting question.
Very. I noticed this in Lebanon as well, where I saw African and Southeast Asian maids, right, who would work for rich Lebanese families. They arrived in Lebanon and they fairly quickly figured out that in Lebanon, like in the dominant discourse, it was a good thing to be Christian, right? Because you're modern and you're progressive and you're not backwards like the Muslims, right? So then you had these maids who, like, in terms of class and education, right? And race as well, right?
And you have to be, you have to be a specific type of Christian as well, not all Christians. You have to be also...
Yes, that's what I mean, Lebanon, definitely, right? But like in terms of their race, their class, education, they were at the very bottom of the food chain. But then they realized that being Christian was actually of advantage.
Give them leverage.
Absolutely. And then you saw all these African and Southeast Asian maids walking around like with the biggest crosses ever. And it was just so weird how they were trying to, right, to leverage like one part of their identity and balance it out against another one. Fascinating, really, really fascinating.
Lebanon is a very interesting place, yes.
Well, I wanted to respond to Leila's, so I've got two responses, one to Leila.
Jump in after you.
All right, cool. So in terms of, you asked, when did hijab become a symbol of oppression? When was it viewed as a symbol of oppression? Now, my instinctive answer is that the process began when Eurocentrism began, namely during the imperial age, during the Westphalian Treaty. Now, I know that at that time, Christian or secular non-Christian women still dressed differently to today. They still revealed, they still covered, they may have worn longer dresses than today or whatever it is. I'm aware of that, right? But that point there was when the world was viewed as anything that is Judeo-Christian or Western European is the norm, and anything that's not part of that culture is now suboptimal or different or exotic or oppressive even, okay? Now, when the norm began to change the way they express themselves, and when certain norms, social norms changed, for example, you know, it became more acceptable, or as Jennifer rightly pointed out, in the 70s, it became a sign of empowerment and liberty to wear a miniskirt for some people. Then at that point, not doing that is suboptimal, because it's not in the Eurocentric position. The Eurocentric position is the default position. And I think that is linked to why we now view hijab as an oppressive force, because simply it's not the way that Europeans express themselves.